Welcome back to the Rink Report podcast. I'm your host, Jason Cooper, alongside Will Scouch from Scouching. You can find him on X at Scouching. Also, check out his website, scouching.ca, and his YouTube channel at Scouching. Draft extraordinaire, Draft Wizard. We have a big episode coming at you today, and we're going to be talking about obviously the NHL Draft, how it relates to the Leafs, because obviously that's what we do here is we find everything hockey related and related back to the Leafs. Will, I appreciate you joining us today. Any thoughts off the hop, or any thoughts about this draft in general off the hop that you want to kind of get off your mind?
It's definitely one of the more interesting classes I remember in the last few years. I've said this a few times. I'm not the type of person who is this draft class is good or bad. I don't think that's the right way to put it, but there's a lot of guys where I think there's a very, very wide range of possibilities for their career. There's a lot of players that I think are pretty raw, they need some time to develop. And, I think there's a lot of potentially very useful sort of role players here. And I think that the interesting part is sort of after the first few picks go off the board. I'll be very interested to see who picks whom next week. There's a lot of ways a lot of those teams could go. But yeah, I mean, it's always really interesting to follow these guys and all this. And I mean, it's a very interesting class, I would say, full of guys that I think are very, if you're a student of the game, so to speak, could be really, really interesting to track over the next little while.
Yeah, and we're going to get into all of that here today. Before we do, want to give a quick shout out, of course, for our sponsors over at Manscaped. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to announce that smooth sack summer is officially upon us. When you're playing in the summer sun, make sure you're groomed from pubes to bun. Thanks to our friends over at Manscaped, you can make this the smoothest season yet. The Performance Package 5.0 Ultra is the ultimate bundle to keep your boys downstairs cool while looking hot. Join the 10 million men worldwide who trust Manscaped with our exclusive offer. Get 20% off plus free shipping when you go to manscaped.com and use the code RINKRAT. That's RINKRAT. Summertime and the trimming is easy. Obviously, Manscaped been working with us for a long time here. So make sure you check it out. If you're looking to get some new men's grooming products, make sure you check it out. Head to their website, get 20% off plus free shipping when you use code RINKRAT. That's RINKRAT at manscaped.com. That's 20% off plus free shipping with code RINKRAT, RINKRAT. Apologize for that. Well, we just got to get those sponsors ads.
It's hot out. I get it. It's insane. I understand totally.
Yeah, I'm dying here. I need to get AC in this room. But anyways, let's move on. So you kind of alluded to it off the hop, and you kind of talked about how obviously this draft is interesting at the top of the board, very interesting players, but also after those first few picks, you feel like there's a lot going on there. So do you feel like, just in general, just wide scope, taking a step back, do you feel like it's one of the more deeper drafts in recent memories? Do you feel like you said range of outcomes, right? So do you feel like that there's more players further down the board to potentially have higher ceilings?
I think it's not so much that. I think there's just a lot of players further along the board where I could look at them and go, I could see this guy filling in on a third pair, or I could see this guy being a third line, energy winger, or this guy could play bottom six on my team any day, right? Like there's a lot of that just doesn't have that sort of X factor trait that really sets them apart. There's also a lot of guys this year who you can tell are really intelligent players. Like there's a few examples, but like just guys where when you watch them, you go, you get it, right? Like you totally understand where your line mates are, when to hit them with passes, how to do it. All that stuff, you got it down. You make plays, you're selfless. There's a lot going on in your favor, but the NHL is a different story. And like, it's not like you won't get there, but it's a ways away talent wise, but I don't want to say that to like take away from the player. I think that building around smarts and competitiveness and selflessness are really, really good traits to work with. There's just a lot of that, just a lot of guys where you go, yep, I could see you doing a thing in an NHL lineup, and I could see these other guys, maybe not in the NHL as they are, but the framework is there and the mindset is there and the way that they need to play is kind of there. So it's just a matter of how far they go from here.
Okay, yeah, and just looking at the top half of the board, because of course, I'm always curious about everyone's always curious about the guys at the top. Yeah. It feels like there's a big glut of defensemen at the top, and they kind of have, there's like different styles, right? Like there's a bunch of different defensemen out there. Obviously, we talked about Zane Parekh off air before the show, very purely offensive kind of guy. You have Anton Silyev, who's just like a absolute 6'7" big monster, Sam Dickinson, who's kind of like of the London Knights, all around guy. So I'm just curious, how do you like evaluate defensemen, and like what traits do you look for most in defensemen that you value?
Yeah.
And are there like certain archetypes that you look for, or is it just tell me about a little bit about your process when analyzing defensemen in this top end of the draft?
Yeah, defensemen are tricky. I've done it. I've done this for a few years now. I think defensemen are where things get really hairy. I think teams really search for defensemen in the draft, and I think that they can maybe overvalue, just the likelihood that they're going to get as impactful a defenseman as maybe a forward they could get. But that doesn't mean that all defensemen drafted in the first round are bad. I did some work at the Ottawa Hockey Analytics Conference a few years ago during the pandemic, where I established and saw that there are just as many top 50 defensive value players in the NHL that are undrafted as there are second round draft picks, right? Like the value of defense, I think, is still a bit of a gray area, and evaluating it in a 17, 18-year-old player is really tricky. That being said, like my whole exercise all the time is I want to find players who are as good at as many things as I can possibly find to sort of hedge my bets as best I can. So for me, I mean, it comes down to kind of style of play preferences, but for defensemen, I look at the NHL and look at defensemen who perform in the NHL and go, look, maybe you want those offensive leaning guys like a Quinn Hughes. Of course, you want some of those guys on your team. I love Cale Makar. I love that. And But those are special players. And I think that generally you want guys who can get around the ice. That's not just fast, but really mobile, smooth pivots. They can adapt to changes in directions of play really well. They can create gaps if they have the puck. They can make a first pass. They can maintain possession of the puck. To me, a defenseman is a player who is simply really effective at getting the puck back when they don't have it and moving it up the ice when they do. Once it's in the offensive zone, the rest is a bonus to me. So guys who do show really well in the offensive zone, I enjoy it, sure. But at the end of the day, I'm looking for players that perform outside the offensive zone, and then the offensive zone is a bonus. And that kind of goes for forwards as well, but especially for defensemen. There are traits there that I think I really, really look for. And so for me, a lot of the defensemen this year I have a little bit lower than most people. And there are some defensemen that I still have pretty high that I really, really like the potential of. And they all have their issues. They all have their strengths. But for me as a defenseman, as a person looking for a defenseman, I mean, I don't really think so much about size, but there is a trade-off there. If you want to draft a 5'10", 5'11" defenseman, well, they better have these other traits ready to go in spades, right? But if you want to go 6'5", 6'6", 6'7", the same principle applies. There are things that they absolutely need to have in order to be effective players. So it really just depends on the player and the context, but I think the way I would summarize it is like, I want guys who can somehow get the puck back, gain possession of the puck, move it up the ice, and the rest is a bonus. That's really it. And how they do it, you can dig into specifically, but that's a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, so like you have some non-negotiables for players depending on like their size, or like depending on their archetype. If you want them to be able to do certain things, and that's kind of how you value them.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say I have anything where it's like a non-negotiable, but there is sort of when I zoom out and look at the whole picture of this player, how much is there that needs work? How much is there that I can really depend on? Like when I point and look at the defenseman, I can go, I can see you doing X on my team. There are sometimes players where I see that and I go, I could see this player doing X in the NHL, but I'm not sure I would want it on my team. But someone who might disagree with me or see the game a little differently from me, sure. I just feel like I'd be able to counter what that player could bring with other players that I like. So it really comes down to what you like and what your taste is. But there are multiple ways of being good at hockey. There are multiple ways of driving results, especially if you're a defenseman. Some guys like to score their way out of trouble. Some guys, they might have skating deficiencies, but they make up for it in other ways. That's fine. It's just a matter of your risk tolerance. And I feel like the NHL, the way that it is, the risk tolerance for defensemen is pretty low. Like you really want your defensemen to defend well and just be safe and move the puck efficiently, because the NHL is a very structure heavy, high pace, high intensity and physical league. So you got to move the puck quickly, think quickly, do things quickly and get moving. So that's kind of what I'm looking for. But there are, I mean, I'm definitely looking for really, really mobile players more than anything, guys who can close gaps, whether it's players coming at them straight on, guys coming at them left or right, to their left or right, chasing gaps behind them, closing races on loose pucks, all those things. So it's difficult to just encapsulate, but it all kind of goes into a blender. And at the end of the day, I just kind of go, here's what I think, and we'll see what happens.
We'll go a little bit more in depth on some players here, but if you're looking to get like a really good overview of a bunch of players, you can check out Will's Twitter account @Scouching. His pinned tweet has I think you've written up of 88 players or some crazy, like a large list of players.
The last list that came out. Yeah. So we've got there's another one coming on Monday. So
okay,
it'll be
even
something.
Bigger?
Yeah.
All right. Sounds good. So yeah, you can go check that out if you're interested in that stuff. But yeah, let's get a little bit more into the granular stuff here and talk a little bit more about players. One player that I've been that I was kind of wondering and thinking about heading into this year is a guy like Cole Eiserman, who is, I mean, before like 2 years ago, you kind of couldn't hear enough about this guy and how he's probably projected to maybe be the first overall pick. And then all of a sudden he falls down the board, and then now he kind of has risen back up a bit. What are your thoughts on just like the ping pong of his, I guess, consensus ranking, and what are your thoughts on him as a player in general?
I think Eiserman is a really fascinating player. I think he's really had a lot of growth in his game from last year to the end of this season. I remember watching him last year and going, man, there's a talented player here who can really score. There's no issue with that. He can put the puck in the net, but there's more to the game than just shooting the puck. And he was a pretty rough around the edges type of player. Like I remember early this season, managing the puck, his shot selection was really questionable at 5-on-5. He was not really chipping in as much defensively as you would want for a player. And when he did, he could be a little reckless and not really planning out things that much. He just seemed like a bit of a, I say this hesitantly, but a little bit of a difficult player to play with. A guy who you could give him the puck in the offensive zone and he'll blast it into the back of the net. But the rest of the picture, again, like what we were talking about earlier, getting the puck into the offensive zone in the first place, that was a bit of a soft area for him. The skill level wasn't quite refined enough. He was, hanging on to the puck a little bit too much and taking on a little bit too much himself. Without the puck, he was kind of soft with his defensive pressure, but then on the next shift, he'll fly. I saw him fly in at a guy with his elbows up in the air, right? Like it's just some of these weird little things where you're going, I'm not sure you know exactly what you want to be and how to get there, but there's something there. And I think by the end of the year, I was really impressed with his under 18. I tracked data from a couple of games that he had at that tournament, and he performed really, really well. I think there's a player who there's playmaking under the surface that bubbles that I think goes a little overlooked. He's a very shot heavy player, but there were some moments there, and there have been during this season where I kind of see him pulling pucks around defenders and stopping up and changing the pace of his game and taking a look and doing a whole bunch of other stuff that really is stuff you need to see out of a player like that. And I think that with time, he'll continue to improve. And the real advantage with him too is, a lot of these players at the top end of the draft, as is tradition, are all, late 2005 born players. They're all these sort of older cohort players. But then there's Eiserman, who is barely eligible for this year's draft, right? Like he's within a month of being a 2025. So if he's having the season he's having now, and he's a 2025 eligible and he goes to college next year, God only knows how much he's going to perform next year and where we would think he would be if he were born in, say, late September instead of late August. So to me, he has a bunch of advantages in that area, considering where he is now with his game. And I think he brings a lot to the table. It's just I don't think he's quite put it all together yet. And I think people are starting to see that he's maybe slowly starting to put it together a little bit. I've had a lot more faith in him recently since the new year, I would say. I still am not sure exactly what type of ceiling there is in his game. Like I still think he's going to be a pretty complimentary, 30 goal scoring, 25 assist, maybe more guy who, has some issues, but can make it work in the NHL and put the puck in the net and be a power play threat. There's something there. So you're not going to get a bad player. It's just a matter of like, I think there's something special there, but just a matter of putting it all together over the next couple of seasons.
Yeah, and it's about kind of getting the right team, the right player to the right team and giving him that right development path to like untap that potential. And like you said, give him that kind of identity of like what the type of player he wants to be. Just looking at your rankings right now, is there someone that you have who is a lot higher than consensus versus and a lot lower? If you want to get into that, do you want to just kind of mention those two players? And then also someone who you feel like right now compared to consensus is going to I don't know how in tuned you are with like what teams are doing in the sense of like where guys might get reached at. Is there someone who's like might be a little bit of an off the board pick in the first round that you're expecting as well?
Yeah, I mean, for me, there are a few players that I really, really like that I think people have kind of either soured on or don't see things the way I do, and that's okay. The two biggest ones I would say, I still am a huge believer in Adam Jiricek, defenseman in Czech Republic or Czechia, whatever you want to say. Really rough start to the year. Like the Holenka and his first couple of months of pro hockey in Czechia were rough, but I felt like as the World Juniors started to show up in the last few weeks and month before he went there, I thought his game started to really sort of settle in at the high level of play that he played at. He looked a lot more comfortable there. He was still losing physical battles, and like moving the puck under pressure was still a bit of a problem, but it was getting better. And that's a tough change when you're going from junior hockey in Czech Republic to pro hockey at the top division. A lot of players will play at the second division and sort of sit in that level for a little bit before taking the jump to the top division on a loan. He didn't do that. And at the World Juniors, I thought he played really, really well for a draft eligible defenseman. He just got hurt. So I can see why people are concerned. You know, he had a rough start to the year. It's a pretty brutal knee injury that ended his season, and that sucks. But knee injuries nowadays aren't really what they used to be. I mean, I know that still, if you rip your ACL, you are at risk of ripping it again in the future. But the rehab techniques and the surgical techniques are a lot more advanced than they were 5, 10, 15 years ago. And so I think I'm a little less concerned about that. And his brother blew out his knee, and we're all forgetting that kind of happened as well, and he's fine. So I still have him as a valuable player. I think his back half of the year, like quite a few players after the World Juniors, like a lot of players kind of had a slow start to the year, and then they went to the World Juniors, and I think they gained a lot of confidence. And then the rest of the year, they felt a lot better on the ice. So I'm a guy that puts my weight behind him. Another one is Alphonse Frey, who I have spoken to a few people who think I'm insane. I know on the team side, there's a couple of people who don't even think he's going in the second round. He might be a third round guy. And that honestly baffles me. I think that if we want to talk about a player who brings modern offense to a defensive player, I think he's a perfect example. You know, when you look at a guy like Quinn Hughes or a Luke Hughes or a Cale Makar, like all of those players, the way that they use their feet to sort of trick and deceive players and, you know, change directions and keep opponents guessing, he does that. And there aren't very many players in this draft who do that. I don't think there are any, right? Like even a Zane Parekh doesn't really quite do it the same way he does to generate offense. He's a guy who I think quarterbacks a rush really, really well. He is a great puck retriever in the defensive end. He can sort of battle off guys who are chasing him down. He's a little bit rough in terms of monitoring defensive rushes, and there's some areas where I'm kind of like, okay, yeah, like you got walked there and that wasn't great. But taken as a whole, I mean, he just keeps producing everywhere he went. He was the highest scoring defender on the Swedish junior team this year, over the course of the whole year. At all international tournaments, and he didn't look out of place doing so either. I really, really have enjoyed watching him play. And look, if he is a third round pick, like I mean, I'm happy to take him. And even if he doesn't work out, then fine. But I have him ranked really, really high, a little lower than I did earlier in the year. But I still think that there's a tremendously talented player there. And if we're thinking about in the NHL, you give him 4 or 5 years in Sweden to develop and a year in the AHL or something, to refine things and learn how to play the style of play he wants to play at a higher level. Like he's going to the second division pro league in Sweden next year, playing for a team that should fight for promotion to the SHL. So he'll play on a good team, probably get some good minutes. I don't know if he'll be on the power play, but it's a test for him. And I think he'll adapt and get there. And then he'll take a step from there. And I think if he continues to do that, he'll be a great player. So those two guys definitely are higher on my list than a lot of people. In terms of lower, I have Artyom Levshinov quite a bit lower, I think. He's in my mid-teens, and I've seen people thinking that he might go top 2. And if he doesn't go top 2, he might go shortly after that. I just think with him, there's a lot of work left to be done. Like, I can see him being an NHL player, no question. He's physical enough. He's mobile enough. He shows all the right habits. There's a lot that's sort of there. but I think there's just a ways to go to get there. Like I had Scott Wheeler on my show yesterday, and we both agreed that we both would be pretty disappointed if whoever drafts him thinks that he's NHL ready and jams him in there right away or puts him in the AHL right away. We think another year in college would certainly not hurt him, because there are areas where I think he's pretty rough around the edges, both defensively and moving the puck up the ice. And I think he projects a little bit more limited offensively than his points might indicate, just based on how he generates his offense, especially against good competition. I have a little bit of doubt there about him, but I mean, I could see him being a perfectly solid, rock solid defensive player who can move the puck decently well. I just think there's other players that I think could play more of an impactful role that I see more in, that I'm more sure about, that just kind of knocks him down a little bit. So if a team disagrees and a team picks him top 3, then fine, go nuts. But I just feel like there's other players that I would look at first. Other than that, I don't think there's anybody that I have like that everybody has really high that's way down my draft board. There's a few players that I don't have ranked, but those guys might be late first, early, mid-second round picks that, they might be role players to some people, but to me, they're not. But other than that, I mean, Connor Yakimchuk is one I also have some doubts about, again, for similar reasons as Zane Parekh, but kind of ratcheted up. I think the skating concerns are really exposed a lot. His defensive game and moving the puck out of his own end is a little bit hair-raising. But he has a ton of skill. He can deke the pants off of a guy challenging him at the blue line, and he can rifle pucks. And that's where a lot of his production comes from, and that's valuable. So how much do you value that? I don't know. Is it a top 15? I don't have him there. But late first round pick for me, sure, I guess. I just think there's, with him, similar to other players, there's a long way to go for me to put my weight behind him.
Yeah, fair enough here. I just curious to see it, and it's always good to know who you never want to be like in line with consensus, right? You want to obviously have a little bit of a different opinion, which is also why like I really value your work, is because I feel like the way you look at the game is a lot different than a lot of these other scouts, which is I find to be very valuable. Anyways, we're gonna get more into Leafs centric stuff here, which is why I assume a lot of people are here. Before we do, I want to give a quick shout out to our sponsors over at DraftKings. The chase for the Stanley Cup continues, and the action at DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of the NHL, is just as hot as it is on the ice, with same game parlays, live betting, odds boost, and so much more. Don't miss out on the Stanley Cup playoffs as they wind down. By the time you listen to this episode, Stanley Cup playoffs might be over, but it's okay. DraftKings has odds for the NHL Stanley Cup next year. If you want to go bet on that, you can do that over at DraftKings Sportsbook. And when you download DraftKings Sportsbook, make sure you use code THPN. If you're new to DraftKings, you got to check it out. You can get new customers can get $5 if they bet, can get 150 bonus dollars if they can bet $5. That's 150 bonus dollars if they bet $5. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now and use code THPN. That's code THPN for new customers to get 150 in bonus bets when you just bet $5 only on DraftKings. The crown is yours. Gambling problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER, or in West Virginia, visit www.1800gambler.net. In New York, calls 8778-HOPE-NEW YORK, or text HOPE New York 467-369. In Connecticut, helps available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org. Please play responsibly on behalf of Blue Hill Casino and Resort in Kansas. 21 plus, age varies by jurisdiction. Void in Ontario. Bonus bets expire 168 hours after issuance. See dkng.co/ice for eligibility and deposit restrictions, terms, and responsible gaming resources. Let's get into the Leafs now. Leafs are picking 23rd overall here. They only have one pick in the first 3 rounds, so they got to make this one. They got to make this one count here. So, if you don't mind, give me a couple names that you like, kind of that you think could still be available in that range. Some of the names I just wrote down here were Michael Haig and Stian Solberg. I just saw that clip of Solberg floating around the internet, just like he's like a bigger defenseman, just laying hits. So yeah, if you want to just tell us a little bit about guys you like there, and maybe touch on those two guys as well. I
mean, the Toronto Maple Leafs, for at least my work, they keep me on my toes. I know that Toronto is a team that this scouting team really values their off-ice testing and how they perform in their sort of, video sessions with these players and sort of evaluating how they see the game. I think there's a lot of that factors in, and that's stuff that we don't really get to see or really understand. And I think that's a big reason why guys like Fraser Minton and Easton Cowan are Toronto Maple Leafs. So I don't know off the top of my head who would be the players that perform that way. I think that there's a player. There are going to be a lot of options for Toronto. I mean, I'm a fan of the strategy every year that if there's a few different guys you like at your pick, you can trade down, and there's in the second round, there's always good players to be had. But there's a lot of options I think Toronto's going to have that for me personally, I think I'd be thrilled to land. I think a lot of people are overlooking Teddy Stiga, for example, an NTDP forward who I think NHL teams like him a lot more than the public does. I've seen him ranked in the second round, pushing the third round. I know some NHL teams love him as a late first guy. I have him way higher for a lot of the same reasons I had Gavin Brindley really high last year. I think I had him at like 9 or 10 because he's a little undersized, but you don't notice. He's fast, he's skilled, he's tenacious. I mean, Teddy Stiga is one of the best forecheckers for a forward I've seen in this year's draft. He's just relentless. We're talking about Cole Eiserman earlier. I don't think Cole Eiserman scores a goal a game without Teddy Stiga setting him up a bunch of times where they played kind of off and on together. Stiga at the under 18s played off of James Haggins, who might go first overall next year, extremely well. They offset each other really, really well and made it really hard for opponents to stop them. And I imagine he'll be there at 23. Again, we talked about Alphonse Frey. I think he's a player that Toronto kind of doesn't have in their stable, like a really dynamic offensive defenseman who can move the puck and skate with the puck and generate offense in a sort of modern NHL way. But if that's not the type of defenseman Toronto's looking for, then I could see them passing on him. You mentioned Michael Hage and Stein Solberg. Look, if Toronto drafts Stein Solberg at 23, it might be a shade higher than I might take him, but I don't think anyone is going to mind. I think both, even the most anti-physical nerds out there would adore Stein Solberg's style of play over time. I think your uncle in Bowmanville would love Stein Solberg. I think the media will love Stein Solberg. Like, he's such an interesting person. Just brings so much to the table in terms of, intangibles, so to speak. He's a tough player. He's a tough customer. He's a jerk, if I can say that. He's a real piece of work on the ice. He just screams NHL player, right? Like, to me, I see a lot of a player like a Radko Gudas there, a guy who is mean and nasty and maybe doesn't score 60 points as a defenseman, but like, you don't really care. He might score 15 goals and have 17 assists and just be ripping shots from the point and hitting everything that moves and everything. He's a little rough around the edges, I think. I think there's a guy who moving the puck is a little bit of a challenge for him still. Dealing with higher pace play is a little tough. But if he figures that out and really sort of gets a good partner to work off of, I think he would just fit in perfectly. And he's a great personality too. So I think everyone would just really, really like him in Toronto. And I think he would be perfectly fine with a big market like Toronto. Michael Hage, I mean, he's a Toronto kid. I think he's a player who Toronto, it makes sense they might target him, not just because he's from Toronto, but I think Toronto also puts a lot of value in trajectory, and he was injured a lot last year. He had a bit of a rough start to the season this year too. I think the first couple of months he was a little bit heavy-footed and just not quite as confident or determined as I think he became as the year went on. But still really, really skilled player, dual threat offensive player, brings a lot to the table that I think, in that range makes a lot of sense. And I think there are some teams that might value him a little more. I think the skating and the ability to generate quickness and explosiveness is a little bit of a work in progress still, and he can get left behind defensively, flat-footed and such in transition, which is a little tough, especially for a center. But that doesn't mean he can't get there, and I feel like Toronto could go that direction too. There's a ton of options. I mean, like, again, if you want to throw out a totally shot in the dark guy like a Jet Luchenko or a Linus Eriksson, those are two guys who are like what we were talking about at the top. Really smart, really capable and selfless hockey players who just elevate the players they play with. Linus Eriksson was playing first line minutes in the playoffs as his team tried to sort of get themselves in the SHL, and he didn't look out of place there. I think he performed really, really well. He's got a pretty good shot as well, so there's a bit of offense to him, but I think he projects as more of just a good third line, smart all-around center to have on your team. But Luchenko, I think, has a ton of potential, and similar to Eiserman, he's really young. And I think just the way that he plays, you watch it and you kind of go, yeah, this kid gets it. He knows how to play as a team. He knows how to use his line mates, and there's a lot there. Toronto's going to have a lot of choice, I think. I think there's a lot of good players.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think this draft has a whole lot of potentially great players, like all-timers, but there are a lot of really good ones and a lot of good options that I think could round out a lineup that maybe there's potential for something more, right? If in a few years things break right, or they get the right coach who really it makes them tick and all that, you never know. So I think that's what Toronto's looking for. Someone who they think just being in Toronto's system elevates them and makes them tick. I don't know who that is, but I think there's going to be plenty of good options.
Yeah, a couple names that you listed there just for people on the recap: Teddy Stiga, Alphonse Frey, Stian Solberg, Michael Hage, Jet Luchenko, and Linus Eriksson. A couple names to keep an eye on there as well. Looking on like a little bit further down the board, Leafs have 5 picks in round 4 and onwards. 1 in round 4, 3 in round 5, 2 in round 7. It's not not the worst place to be in. Obviously, having more darts is better than no darts. So who are some guys who you think might be guys who, I know this is always hard to predict because once you get past like kind of like the second, third round, consensus gets thrown out the window and it's just kind of teams picking their favorite players. But is there someone who you expect to, any players who you expect to go in those later rounds who you really like, who you'd be like kind of banging the table for, even though they might even go undrafted?
Yeah, I mean, it always kind of happens this way. I generally have a decent idea of the types of players that teams might set aside for one reason or another that I just really believe in. And there's a few I think Toronto will have a chance at in the middle rounds. And I think in the NHL draft, if you do your homework, you can do damage everywhere. So the first name I'd probably bring up is Danil Ustinkov, who kind of has fallen out of favor a little bit. Swiss defenseman, even though the name is Russian. Really interesting player who I've really liked. He's playing in the top division in Switzerland, which is arguably the fastest and most skilled European league there is. He's not playing a ton of minutes, but he plays a really safe and dependable game, and I think there's upside for more. Another name I've really liked that might be available in that range is Clark Caswell of Swift Current. I mean, I track a lot of data pretty much across the board. He is just a rock star. People criticize his skating and the sort of, physical part of his game and as not a strong point, but I see that and go, yeah, but the results are still so positive that if those come a ways, then you're going to probably get a pretty good player. So those two guys for sure. I think people might overlook certain players. I mean, Topias Heinonen plays in Finland. He plays as a teammate of Konsta Helenius. I've liked him since last season. I'm surprised that he's as low as he is on boards because he's playing pro hockey in Finland. I think he does not look out of place there. Every time he leaves his team in Finland and plays somewhere else, whether it's the second division or junior or international junior, he's looked excellent. A little small, and I think that's why he's a little small and plays an intense physical game that I think people kind of go, well, in the NHL, that might not work. But he's also just a great open ice player. He's got a great wrist shot, some good skill to him as well. If he can sort of see the ice a little bit better with the puck, I think there could be a really good player there. And I think he got better as the year went on. Later in the draft, I mean, you got to just kind of take your pick. Usually it's smaller players that go that late. I'm, though, a really big fan of Luke Osborne, a defenseman with Youngstown. I don't know where he's going to go in the draft. I don't hear much talk about him at all. But he is a guy who is really young, a guy who was playing AAA hockey last year and was a 7th defenseman for Youngstown at the beginning of the year and just worked his way up. And he ended up a pretty heavy usage player for them by the end of the season. And really, really tremendously smart positional defender. Needs to work on the physical side of the game, can kind of get beat in close quarters, but he's always sort of in the right place at the right time, sees the ice really, really well. And has some good footwork and a good shot to go with it that I think you could nurture and get a good player out of. Late in the draft, I mean, I think Toronto could use maybe a goaltender or two. A guy like Cam Hendrickson is a guy who I've liked as maybe a late round flyer. He played Minnesota high school this year and played with the Omaha Lancers a bit this year. He's not the biggest goalie in the world, but he's big enough and really athletic. Omaha was also terrible this year, and in the games he played, I think he was facing like 35 to 40 shots a night and putting away 92.5% or something like that on and that's for a workload like that. That's pretty impressive for a guy coming right out of high school. And I mean, he played for a team that has never been to the Minnesota high school state finals, and he carried them all the way to the finals instead of just being eliminated in the first round or anything. He was there. I think he gave up 1 goal in the 2 games that led up to the final where they lost. So I like him as well as a goaltender. So there's a lot of interesting options for them. I think they could go a variety of directions, but generally it's the smaller, energetic, guys or the really skilled Europeans that I think fly under the radar a little bit for one reason or another. But those are the guys. Evan Gardner is another goaltender that I'd really look at. I'm surprised he's not getting more attention. Saskatoon goaltender. Toronto has drafted from Saskatoon a few times before. Fraser Minton is part of the Blades. I would not be surprised if they maybe go for a guy like that because his numbers, even looking beyond his save percentages, are really good. So there's a number of options. I mean, this year, as with any year, like if you're really doing your homework, I think there are good players to be had pretty much everywhere.
Yeah. And just quickly, just to touch on the philosophy of like yours when you're like taking a look at goalies, is there anything that you look at in particular? It's because I know it's a little bit of a hard game to play there. Just if you want to get into that a bit.
Yeah. I mean, so this season, I've actually tried to go out of my way to study more about goaltending. I mean, I was a goaltender until I was 6, so I know a little bit about the position. I have put goalie pads on before a few times, but in terms of high level goaltending, I'm not really super well versed. So I mean, I try to find smart people who I trust, read about what maybe NHL goaltenders who have been public about their stuff talk about, different goaltending styles, why certain things work, why certain goals go in, really trying to study NHL. Like one thing I did early when I was doing this is looking at the best NHL players and really wondering what made them special. You know, really pay attention to the details of, okay, this player is doing XYZ, bam. That's what you kind of need in order to be a high-end NHL player. Okay, great. And you kind of work your way backwards, or you look at the guys who get drafted 3rd, 4th, 5th round and go, how did these guys not go in the 1st round? And then you look at them in the NHL and you maybe can find footage of them when they're younger and you go, okay, like I can sort of see a pattern here of stuff that you might want to be looking for. With goaltenders, it's a little trickier, but I mean, for me, generally speaking, NHL goaltenders that are really high-end, they save a lot of pucks all the time, multiple seasons before they're drafted. So that's like a baseline for me, but that's just save percentage. So I have the advantage of having a platform like Instat, which has a little bit of deeper goaltending metrics that I can then derive more metrics from that really help sift through who's doing what. Like there might be players in Russia, for example, putting up 940 save percentages, but then you look at the deeper numbers and like 80% of their shots are coming from the blue line. And it's like, well, okay, yeah, they should be saving those. So it's those details that you need to look at. But in terms of on the ice, I mean, to me, athleticism is everything, right? Like if you can get around the crease and you can control your body movements and you can follow and you can follow the puck and always be square to where the puck is, that's a huge advantage. Jesper Wallstedt a couple years ago, that's what stuck out to me, is he was like Megatron. Everywhere the puck was going around the defensive zone, he was just locked in, following it everywhere it went. And always, you know, as soon as he recognized that there was a shot coming, he was on the ice in a butterfly, ready to go. And you could tell that he was just beyond his years in terms of capability and the way he sees the game and sees the defensive zone. So those types of things I'll always look for. And so for me, I'm always looking for athleticism and guys who, you know, stay square in the net, don't overcommit to one side or the other, or at least, you know, it can save pucks, you know, because there aren't very many goaltenders in the NHL who are playing at a really, really high level, who, when they were drafted, they were, say, playing for the Erie Otters and were like an 885 goaltender. Those generally are the guys that get drafted and kind of just become an okay AHL guy because they just have so much further to go. So I don't know. It's still really tough. You know, goaltending is also a very mental position. And so there's a lot that, you know, you can't really evaluate. So if it were up to me, I would have someone on staff who is very in tune with what goaltenders need and maybe is a goaltender themselves and can sort of evaluate that in a player. There's a lot that goes on there, but I am trying to understand a lot more about what goes into a great goaltender and trying to backtrack and see what is out there with the goalies this year.
Yeah, goalies are always hard to predict. That's why obviously going to circle back and come back to the Leafs here. Just let's touch a little bit on their prospect pool. 3 goalies who the Leafs have drafted over the last 4 years that kind of stick out in my mind, who I just want to get your quick thoughts on, if you can. Dennis Hildeby, Vyacheslav Peksa, I probably pronounced that wrong, and Artur Akhtemov. Just give me your quick thoughts on them.
I mean, I'm probably most familiar with Hildeby and Akhtemov. I can't say I've seen a ton of Vyacheslav Peksa. I didn't see much of the East Coast League this year. But I remember watching Hildeby before they drafted him, and a buddy of mine who's in Sweden sent him to me and was like, hey, this guy, like everybody's talking about him in Sweden. He's gigantic, but don't let that sort of fool you. He's come a long way in his game, and that's true. You look at his numbers from when he was first time draft eligible. He was just a big, lanky guy who just hadn't quite figured it out yet. But, from what I see of Hildeby, like, he's a pretty big and athletic guy who just seems to sort of angle the game well. Again, the NHL is always so tricky. You never really know. Akhtiamov, he hasn't really been tested yet. I think the VHL in Russia, the second pro division, it's a decent league, but it is not the KHL, and I don't want to jump to conclusions, but again, he passes that baseline test for me of like, he just stops pucks. Every single team he plays for, everywhere he goes, he's stopping pucks, and that has value. And I can't tell you exactly why he's been so good, but again, a lot of it comes down to that athleticism and that positioning, that knowledge of positioning that certainly helps you stop a lot of pucks, especially at these lower levels. I like Hildeby quite a bit from what I've seen. I can't say that I'm looking at him going, yeah, he's going to be Joseph Wool's backup or the starting goalie in 5 years. I just don't think you can really project that. There's a lot of factors that go in, especially the mental side of things. Can you keep up with the workload, the travel, the fans, the environment? Can you deal with all that? Like, I'm sure Toronto is really putting that in their heads and making sure that they can do that. So it's a big, I don't know, but those guys, I like them, especially those two that I'm much more familiar with. And I think Hildeby is a very interesting player based on how he's played with the Marlies. So time will tell. But I'm not nearly as familiar with those as some of the skaters that I think we're about to talk about.
Okay, yeah, I'm gonna do a little bit of rapid fire here, if
Yeah.
that's okay with you. You obviously, I'm just gonna fire out a name. We're gonna take a look at some of the least prospects, and you're just gonna kind of give me your thoughts on them.
Sure.
I feel like the number one guy to start with right now is Easton Cowan. So first guy, Easton Cowan. Let's hear it.
You know what? I really like Easton Cowan. I watched him last year. I don't think I really appreciated him until maybe the last month and a half before the draft. He got way better over the course of the season. Like, super competitive, super intense player, really smart puck distributor as well. I think he just plays a really well-rounded game. I think a lot of people looking at his sort of MVP awards and all the accolades he's gotten and the point production are seeing a super, super high-end guy. I still think he's a very, very useful sort of middle of the lineup Swiss Army knife type player. He's competitive enough to play hard off the puck, but I feel like all in all at the NHL level, he might, be just a good asset to have on the team. That being said, I do really like him, and I hope that he's as good as he can possibly be. But I just think that there's, just short of that special tier of hockey player that in the NHL you just absolutely have to have. But I think he's going to be a great asset, a great player, a day in, day out competitor, and Toronto definitely needs types of guys like that.
Okay, and then I'm going to make it a little bit harder for you. Give me like a project, like your projection for them. Maybe like a ceiling projection and a floor projection for him.
Yeah, I mean, I could see something in the lane of a second line center, just a good second line 200-foot center, or a really good, again, 200-foot puck distributing center that plays behind two premier guys up in front of him. I think that's perfectly acceptable. And I feel like that's kind of where he falls. Or he moves to the wing and just becomes a more complementary energy offense guy. That could work too, but I like him where he is as a center for sure.
All right, sounds good. Next guy we got up here is Fraser Minton. Same question. Just give me your quick thoughts and then give me floor and ceiling.
I'm still not totally sure what I think of Fraser Minton. I mean, I've seen him quite a bit. I did not have him ranked when he was drafted. I certainly wouldn't have thought he was a top 40 player. And granted, he's, I think, come a ways since he was drafted. I still think that the NHL upside is a bit of a question mark. He is clearly very, very intelligent as a player. Definitely brings a lot to the table in terms of his sort of the way he sees the game. I still think he's more of a bottom six center. Like, I would not put him ahead of Easton Cowan on my depth chart, but as a fourth line center, something like that, maybe I could see it. He's a smart positional player. He's a selfless sort of playmaker. He's got a pretty decent shot as well. I think it's just that, the NHL time, you can't put too much stock into limited NHL minutes a player gets, but I think you saw a little bit of the limitations in his game when he was playing in the NHL. I don't know if he was ready for it, which is okay. But I'll be very curious to see how he does with the Marlies, assuming that's where he ends up. because I feel like maybe he's a guy in a couple of years develops a little bit more and can become sort of a bottom six NHL center that maybe can kill some penalties.
Yeah, okay, I love that. That's kind of like I mean, again, I only watched his NHL minutes, and yeah, that's kind of like the what I got from him. A lot of people seem to be over the hill on him. I'm not there yet. Next guy I want to talk about is the new signing, undrafted free agent Cade Weber. Tell me a little bit about him.
Yeah, I mean, I saw a bit of him when Carolina drafted him. He was a guy that I saw a little bit of when he was playing prep hockey, and I went after Toronto got him. I knew people would be asking me about him, so I went and watched a few games of his before he left Boston University. I mean, I don't know. I don't have huge hopes for Cade Weber, but he is a big, pretty mobile guy. I think that he's a Marley for now. I don't know if he's got NHL upside right now because the puck movement isn't super great, but he's a decent shooter. He's a pretty physical guy too. Like I think he could be a maybe down the lineup stopper that sort of leans more heavily into the defending. There's a bit of that Simone Benoit vibe to him. You know, you see Benoit, he's a rangy, big, physical guy who defers to others with the puck on his stick, which is fine. But he played pretty well, you know, in his role and down the lineup. And I think maybe Weber could get there, but I would see how he is as a Marley for sure.
Yeah. Next guy I want to get into is also pretty interesting. Nicholas Mattinen. I mean, I don't know if you haven't heard his story.
Yeah.
Very interesting. The Leafs drafted him in 2016, sixth round pick, 6'4", big defenseman, but also I believe he was the best defenseman in the German league last year, or or is it the second German league? So yeah, tell me a little bit more about him and where you could see him playing. 'Cause 26 years old, he's pretty old. So yeah,
it's a funny twist of fate, isn't it? Right? Like he was a guy who I remember when they drafted him, and I remember watching him a bit because I'd never really paid that much attention to him, and I kind of went, all right, like he's a decent skating big guy who can absolutely crank the hockey puck, and he loves to shoot. Okay, I can see where this guy is going to get points. I can see how this guy is going to score points. I would say the awards he's got in Germany are nothing to shake your fist at. That's a pretty good league over in Europe, in Germany. It's not a joke whatsoever, especially for North American players over there. It's a tough league. I think, you know, usually, I mean, it is an entry level deal, so they do have a bit of flexibility with him if he's not quite NHL ready. It depends on what Toronto does in July. Honestly, I think he's a bubble guy. I'm not so sure. I watched a bit of him in the DEL. He is a pretty good player for that level, for sure. But most players signed out of the DEL generally don't jump into major NHL roles, and I don't think he's going to do that. But again, similar to a Cade Weber, like I think not in the future, but there's a possibility that he could be in the lineup and a shot threat from the point. You know, honestly, Toronto, in my view, hasn't really had a guy who you can just give the puck to at the blue line and he can blast it through the net. Maybe that's kind of the role that they could see him playing, and he plays off of a guy like Simone Benoit down the lineup, third pair, maybe seventh defenseman coming in and out of the lineup. I just, you know, I'm also the type of person who kind of sets my expectations a little more limited. And if he surpasses them, then fantastic. But if you sign a guy out of the DEL and he becomes an everyday NHL player, I think that's a great move, no matter where they play in your lineup. And I think it really depends on what Toronto's team looks like come the fall. But I think he could push for a job. And yeah, from there, I mean, he brings something to the defense group there that I think that they don't really have a whole lot of.
Yeah, that's a story for me to track through. I mean, I know it's going to be a long ways away, but through training camp, that's someone who I'm going to keep an eye on. Another name I have on the list here is Nikita Grabenkin. I see different spellings for his name all over the place. Another guy who's like a skilled forward who did pretty well with the in the Russian juniors last year. I guess he was in the KHL last year.
Yes, he was. Yeah. He did quite well in the KHL this year as well. Honestly, I've liked Grabenkin a lot. When they drafted him, I was really pleasantly surprised because he was a guy that, you know, I saw here and there watching other players in the junior league in Russia. And I thought, all right, like he's a 6'3", whatever sort of power skill winger playing at a low level. He plays really well. He's a really good sort of resilient player, but that's a tough sell for me at the time. I thought, okay, maybe a 19-year-old guy pushing 20 playing in the Russian junior league is a big sort of heavy power guy. A bit of a fish out of water, so to speak, in that league. There's not a whole lot of guys like that. But I did go into the draft going, look, if I wanted a re-entry guy, especially out of Russia, like, he was impressive. I mean, he's been a lot better than I thought he would be since they drafted him. And he's just steadily improved. Magnitogorsk has actually had a few younger players that they just keep elevating season after season and giving more responsibility to. And he's looked pretty good. I mean, again, I think he's more of a, third line power winger who's got some skill, like very much that Matthew Nyes type of player. And I mean, those guys work in the NHL. I mean, I don't know when he's coming over, but he's certainly a legitimate prospect to me. He's got the size, the strength, a good skill level as well. He can finish. There's a lot of good traits to his game that I think he brings to the table that could project to the NHL just fine whenever. And I feel like the longer he is in Russia, the more time he's going to play there, the more minutes he's going to get in a given night. That's going to be beneficial for him. And I mean, a lot of the time with Russian players, they don't want to come over until the NHL team can go, yep, we've got a job for you. Here's what it's going to be. And we're ready to have you in the NHL when we think you're there. And if they're wrong, then they can go back to Russia, right? So I think at some point that's going to happen. I'm not sure it'll be right away, but another year in the KHL, and who knows what happens after that, maybe 2. And I think Toronto could have a nice little pickup from the mid rounds.
Yeah, there's a couple names here I want to mention as well, some undrafted guys. We'll try and close it out quickly here soon. But Jacob Quillen, you want to talk about him?
Oh yeah, is that the goalie? Right? No.
Center out of Quinnipiac.
Quinnipiac, right.
Yeah, they signed him recently. I think it was this past year. It was April 1st they signed him.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, a lot of NCAA free agents are fine. I remember watching Quinnipiac a little bit. He wasn't the guy that was really grabbing my attention. Colin Graff was the one that I think was doing that a lot. Quillian, I remember now watching a bit of him with the Marlies and being curious about him and not really being really blown away with him. I don't really know what I can write home about his game in general. But you know what? It didn't cost them anything but money. And I'm always in favor of getting players into your stable that you think are legitimate that doesn't really cost you a draft pick. You just go to them and say, hey, you want to play for the Leafs one day? And he goes, okay, sure. All right, here's your chance. So it's fine. I wasn't really like blown away by his game. And I think relative to the guys we're talking about, I think my expectations are a little lower.
All right. Last guy on the list then here, Topi Niemela. Yep. I mean, third round pick for the Leafs a couple years ago. Kind of on the outside looking in for the last couple of years for this team. Still only 22, turning 23 this year.
Yep.
What are your expectations for him?
I really like Topi Niemela. I think it's tough because I think that he plays a style of defense that you can't have 6 of them. Mm-hmm. And Toronto has guys like Liljegren and Benoit and a few of these other just really mobile, rangy players with a bit of skill to them who kind of keep it a little bit simple. Niemela is a guy who I've really liked. He's very, very mobile. He's a really good puck manager. I never really saw him as a super high offensive upside guy, but I did see him as a really good, details guy. His puck management skill, his ability to see the ice. I was left a little wanting with him in the preseason, seeing him with the Leafs a little bit here and there. Mm-hmm. But with the Marlies, I think he played pretty well this year. He did have a productive season, which is great. I feel like he could be a guy that steps up as a call-up this year. You kind of give him a few games and see how he does. If there's an injury or something, I feel like with the way he plays, there might be a little bit too much that he doesn't bring to the table outside of what he does really well that could push someone else out of the lineup. But maybe I can't say it's impossible, but again, similar to Matanen and Weber and all those other guys, it depends on who they bring in free agency. But we'll see. But I like Niemela. It's not over for him. And if it doesn't work out in Toronto, I feel like another team with a lot more room on their defense group maybe is able to give him some minutes and see if he gets to be a everyday NHL player.
All right, then last question here before I let you go. We just talked a little bit about the group, the prospect group of the Toronto Maple Leafs. Give me a grade and give me like maybe strength and weaknesses you feel like of the pool.
Yeah, I mean, if I were giving it a let's use my own system where it's like a number is kind of the general tier, and I'd give it a letter of like the depth of which is in that tier. Like I'd say Toronto's prospect group is like a 2B. Like it's a good group of players. I think there's a lot of solid NHL talent potentially there if things break right for them in the next season or two. But I don't think there's any like truly game-breaking players there, which makes sense considering they haven't drafted at the high end, let alone in the first round a whole lot recently, or will in the future. So I don't have any huge sort of expectations for them. But I do think that they have a lot of good options. I think they draft well, considering that considering they don't draft often in the last couple of years. I think they've pulled some rabbits out of their hat that I think have surprised me even. And so that's something you can always fall back on. But I'll be very, very curious to see what they do this year, because they have a bunch, like you said, a bunch of picks in that mid to late range. They have clearly done their homework on a lot of these guys that they have drafted in the past in the middle range of the draft, and we'll see what happens. But I'd say a 2B. Like, it's good, but not super, super high end. There's no Connor Bedard, but there's a lot of good, and I think that's kind of where they sit.
And they get hurt a little bit by Matthew Nyes being that good and graduating out of that system as well, right?
Too. And Nick Robertson, who knows what happens with him, but he's another good player that I think should have a bigger role.
Yeah, young, promising talent on this team. All right, anyways, thank you so much for joining us today, guys. That was Will Scouch. Will, thank you so much for joining us today. Make sure you check him out on YouTube at Scouching, everywhere at Scouching, on X, on, I assume, Threads, on Instagram, probably. I'm not sure. And then also make sure to check out the website, scouching.ca. Tons of great information on there. And guys, if you're new to the channel and you like this stuff and you made it this far, 55 minutes through, all you got to do is press that like button. And if you really, really like it, press that subscribe button so you can get caught up on the latest videos that we drop. Thank you so much for tuning in, guys. Go Leafs.